racism, it's a problem in Scotland. It's a problem in Canada. I have lived in Scotland. I have lived in Canada. Scottish Parliament recently proposed a law banning hate speech. The draft of the law has for the time being been thrown out or sent to have revisions because the first draft would have pretty much banned any use of speech whatsoever, potentially. It was much too broad and ill-defined. I notice the public response to this has been a demand to define racism. I think this is 180 degrees wrong. What we need to define is speech. I don't believe that freedom of speech exists so that you can interrupt someone and insult them because of the color of their skin while they're buying groceries or while they're standing in the lineup to pay for their groceries at the grocery store. Is that what you mean by speech when you say freedom of speech? Would you really be opposed to a law that limits your freedom of speech in that context? Speech is now being used politically to mean the whole range from carefully considered academic articles published in peer-reviewed volumes that sit in the library, down to fights between boyfriends and girlfriends, husbands and wives, that may indeed these days end up on the internet, on Instagram Live, on YouTube, you name it, right? Speech has been used in such a broad sense that it's inevitable we have to legislate limits to freedom of speech. Let me say this. When I lived in Scotland, people thought I was older than I was because I was tall for my age. In general, I was taller than everyone in Scotland. At that time, I hope the average height has increased since then. I seemed to tower like a giant over both children and adults when I was in Scotland, but I was still a child. And people tried to start fistfights with me because I was a Jew. Based on my appearance, they tried to insult me and say racist things to me and start fistfights with me. That only happened to me one other time in my life I can remember, and that was in Florida, in the United States of America. Okay. Is that speech? Is that the freedom of speech you want to preserve? We have a very strangely parallel problem in the United States with protest, right? There's a sense in which we all want to preserve the freedom to protest, but we have to define protest. The United States Constitution does not. Any protest whatsoever is supposedly legal and protected under their Constitution. Well, some people think that an effective form of protesting against the corruption or incompetence of the police is to burn down a fast food restaurant, burn down a Wendy's. A woman, I might add an African-American woman, a black woman, was shot at, and as I recall, her daughter in the back seat died. She herself didn't die because she was trying to drive her car past that same Wendy's. And a group of armed protesters, themselves also African-American, part of the Black Lives Matter movement, they felt a legitimate form of protest was to block off that intersection and to have a blockade, to prevent any traffic from passing by, and to use guns to force people to stop or turn around if they wanted to drive by. And she was just trying to go, I think she was trying to drive, her daughter had been visiting a friend, and she was trying to drive from one house to another. Right? This had nothing to do with politics, not for her. Right? So what is protest? Right? You see how the effort to define racism more narrowly or more precisely can be a dangerous distraction from what the real political problems are. Okay? I have been in one situation, I was actually in England, not Scotland, where some townies were denouncing, basically in racist terms, an outsider because, you're not from around here. Now, I admit, this is not strictly speaking racist. This is like localism versus foreignerism. It's some other term could be used here. It's xenophobia, maybe in its purest form. And man, I've never lived in any other culture like that. I've never lived in another culture like Scotland and England, where people are just down for a fist fight or a knife fight or to stab each other with a broken beer bottle. They are down for that broad daylight all the time. They want to fight for no reason at all. They're looking for a reason. They want you to give them a reason, and often enough, racism is the reason. Saw an interview with a man, and he wasn't that young when the interview was conducted. He looked about 25 to me, but he was talking about his experiences as a teenager in Scotland. This guy was black, completely born and raised in Scotland. Showed his mother on camera. By her accent, his mother also seemed to be born and raised in Scotland. I don't know her whole story. So this guy, I mean, he really was as Scottish as I am Canadian. I'm born and raised in Canada, you know. And all his life, starting from when he was tall enough to be perceived as a teenager, white Scottish people were shouting the N-word at him on the street, including like from the front steps of their house. Like they'd see him through the window and they'd run out onto the front porch of their house and start shouting the N-word and other insults, trying to get into a fist fight with him. And partly just because he was a big guy who looked like he'd be a good fight. And many of these fistfights would end with the police showing up. And the police would ask him what happened. And he'd say, oh, well, this guy called me the N-word. And the police would say, well, why didn't you just let him? Why don't you just keep walking? And he said, I just remember this is what he said in the interview. It wasn't a terribly witty or insightful thing. He said, well, he said that to me, not you, didn't he? That was, what he, completely sincere. I mean, it's just obviously it's not the most... It's not the ideal answer to give a police officer, but I think his point was he was insinuating if you, the police officer, had been in my position, you would have beaten this guy up also. Okay? So now those police are in the position of saying this is freedom of speech. Like people literally have the right to come up to you and denounce you because of the color of your skin to your face or shout at you in a grocery store or on the street at any given time. All right? Is that freedom of speech? Is that the freedom of speech you want enshrined in law, that you want in a future constitution? I'm not asking whether or not it's the freedom of speech you already have in the constitution you've got, that fucking piece of crap, worthless constitution from 200 years ago, wherever you live. Sorry, I have viewers all over the world, since World War II in some places, since wherever it is. You live, the Constitution you've written, I'm sure it doesn't give a satisfactory answer. But my point is, it would be very easy to write a satisfactory answer to this. There was a TV show called Jersey Shore. And on one season of that TV show, I used to watch that show with my ex-wife while we were working out at the gym on the step machine. They had the step machines with the TV screen. That was how I first encountered Jersey Shore. And I think it was in reruns. I don't think it was new. I saw most of the episodes of Jersey Shore. I don't know if I saw them all. There is a scene that ends with the police arresting one of the main characters in the show because, and this is all caught on tape, some other people who were at a nightclub with him were running after him and shouting the worst insults they could come up with, Again and again. He was walking away. He was leaving the club. He was walking down the sidewalk with his girlfriend hand in hand. And these guys kept coming up and insulting him and shouting insults loudly. And this is at night on the sidewalk outside. And eventually, after the third or fourth time, whatever it was, he turns around and he punches one of these guys in the face. He's very strong. Just one punch can harm someone for the rest of their lives. Can do terrible damage. Theoretically. It could not, but one punch can change somebody's life, can change your life too. And the police come and arrest him for aggravated assault. And in the United States, as it stands now, freedom of speech means that the guy who ran into the nightclub instigating this fight again and again and again did absolutely nothing wrong. He was enjoying his freedom of speech at 2:00 in the morning on the sidewalk, shouting insults, chasing after someone who was walking away from him, holding hands with his girlfriend again and again. That's protected right now as freedom of speech. It is the wrong question to ask How do we define racism? What we need to ask is, what is the speech that is being protected for political purposes? And what is the type of speech that's being constrained, delimited, ultimately condemned? This always struck me as being the unasked and unanswered question in Thailand. Very briefly, in Thailand, you cannot say anything criticizing the king, criticizing the royal family, criticizing the monarchy, under any circumstances, not even on a Facebook message or what have you. I could understand if they wanted to have a law saying you can't interrupt a religious ceremony that the king is presiding over. You can't interrupt a parade on the main street where you're within 500 meters of the king. I could understand having laws saying, look, freedom of speech doesn't give you the right to disrupt everyone else, what everyone else is doing at this party for the sake of your political cause. But obviously it's tremendously important that people do have the ability to complain, to criticize on Facebook, in newspaper articles, to dispute what really happened in various historical episodes. And I might add, even the most shocking, even the most disturbing of historical episodes. I think I've already mentioned in this video, I'm Jewish, and I know what it's like to be punched in the face and insulted for being Jewish. I do. Okay? I once read an article written by a well-intentioned guy who was pointing out, by the way, also my parents worked in the museum field. He had these great examples of lies about the Holocaust that were in museums. And he was saying he's not a Holocaust denier. One of the examples was of a photograph, and someone working at the museum had painted smoke coming out of a smokestack to make it look more dramatic. So there was white smoke coming out of a smokestack. And he was saying, look, this is really tampering with historical evidence. People look at this. They don't know it's painted on. There's like photoshopping evidence. And he got into some of the technical details about how the gas chambers worked, and was like, it didn't actually produce that kind of smoke. It was this big dramatic column of smoke. He said, look, what actually happened here didn't produce smoke. And part of his point was, if you don't have the freedom of speech to cross-examine, to ask unthinkable, shocking questions, right? Something really important is going to be lost here. Okay? However, that's not the same as having the freedom to interrupt someone at a funeral. Can you guys remember this? Can you guys remember back when gay rights, still more of an open and unresolved case in the United States? Can you remember Christian fundamentalists showing up to protest at gay people's funerals, holding signs, shouting, making noise, cheering, saying that that person is going to hell? Confronting the priest and the grieving parents or the grieving boyfriends and whatever, whoever shows up at this funeral, and saying this person has no right to be buried in a Christian cemetery and they're going to hell, and this is the passage of the Bible that says so, and so on and so forth. Is that what freedom of speech means to you? Is the ability to advocate for homophobia at a funeral? The right to advocate for racism at the grocery store while someone's waiting to check out their groceries? Right? See? What's most disturbing to me of all, I'm now 42 years old. I've never heard anyone else ask this question. I've never heard anyone else discuss this. Karl Popper, a philosopher and a scientist, both, he said that the most disturbing thing to him about his scientific discoveries and his new ideas in philosophy was that he never wanted to believe that they were original. In at least one or two cases, he actually paid a researcher or hired an intern to go through the history books and check, someone else must have pointed this out before. Someone else must have come up with it. It's so obvious, right? And he would be kind of horrified and dismayed to find that nobody else had raised this objection. Nobody else had asked this question. There's no record of this. This is before the invention of Google on the internet now, right? We have a case here in Canada. It's again raising old wounds about racism, and people are asking the same questions. A woman died in hospital, and the employees of the hospital, doctors and nurses, were saying insulting things to her while she lay there dying. It is being interpreted as racism. The much more disturbing possibility is that these doctors and nurses would have been just insulting to a white person, as they were to an Aboriginal person, an Indigenous person, a First Nations person. The woman who was like, it's possible. It's possible it was racism, and it's possible this was unprofessionalism, cruelty, so on and so forth, right? Do you believe in freedom of speech? Do you believe that a doctor or a nurse has the right to stand there and tell you that you deserve to die, that you're a terrible person while you're lying there in your hospital bed dying? And the whole public is responding to this by talking about racism and defining racism and institutional racism, and as if we're going to do some kind of purity test to decide who is and who isn't racist among doctors and nurses. I see a whole political system that inevitably is going to come to the wrong conclusions. It's going to fail to find the right answers because nobody is asking the right questions.